You're watching 12 WKRC TV, a new generation of news. 12 Newsmakers starts now.
So first, and above all, we must save Social Security for the 21st century.
Whether you fall into the camp that thinks the Senate should remove Bill Clinton from office or the camp that thinks they should leave him in place, everyone agrees that those opening substantive lines of his State of the Union address on Tuesday night announced the agenda for the next year. Good morning and welcome to Newsmakers. No government program holds a more important place in the psyche of Americans than Social Security. The fear that when the baby boomers begin to retire, the system will start bleeding red and then quickly go broke creates psychic insecurity and threatens to divide Americans along political and social lines that run a deep rift in our society. These were exactly the same forces that spurred the inclusion of Social Security in the New Deal 64 years ago.
The ravages of the Great Depression in the 1930s finally forced the United States to adopt a Social Security system similar to the one that had existed for decades in Europe. Pressed by a grassroots movement led by California physician Francis Townsend, which called for $200 a month in retirement payments, Franklin Roosevelt finally agreed to a Social Security system in August 1935.
There is still today a frontier that remains unconquered, an America unreclaimed. This is the great, the nationwide frontier of insecurity, of human want and human fear. This is the frontier, the America, that we have set ourselves to reclaim.
Paid for entirely by worker and company contributions rather than general revenues, and excluding millions of workers, including farmers and domestics, the early Social Security system was relatively conservative. In 1942, it paid its first old age benefit to Ida Fuller in Ludlow, Vermont. Since then, the Social Security Administration has issued billions of checks to retirees, and responding to popular pressure from the elderly, has steadily broadened its benefit package, most importantly with the adoption of Medicare in 1965.
To explore the options available for reforming Social Security, I am joined this morning by Congressman Rob Portman. Mr. Portman represents the Ohio 2nd District and serves on the subcommittee directly responsible for studying Social Security reform. Rob, welcome back to Newsmakers.
Thanks, Dan. Good morning. The historian in you came out this morning with all that background on Social Security.
Oh, the historian in me comes out lots of times.
There you go.
What the heck? You were sitting there on Tuesday night. Yeah. What did you think about the section of the speech that President Clinton gave dealing with Social Security? What was your reaction to that part of the speech?
I was delighted that finally the President talked about his ideas on how to preserve Social Security. For the last 2 years, really, the President's been saying this is a major problem, which it is. We know it is because of this demographic change where you have 76 million baby boomers about to retire. People are living longer. And Social Security is a pay-as-you-go system. In other words, what you and I are paying in payroll taxes goes for our parents or grandparents in my case. Therefore, you've got a huge problem coming up. And finally, the President went beyond just acknowledging the problem and talking about it to saying, here's some ideas. Now, his ideas don't go all the way to fix the system, and I don't agree with all of them, but I commend him for finally coming up with some
Let's deal
proposals.
with some of those ideas. One of his ideas was to take, and we may end up arguing about one of the terms here, 60% of the surplus and applying it to directly to the Social Security Trust Fund and letting it start to earn money. The second element, there were a number of elements. The second element was some what he called USA funds or some private investment funds. What about the investment of those surplus funds?
Well, again, I think it's a step in the right direction, but I think it's misleading the way the President has handled it. And frankly, I think Republicans have missed the boat on this too. There is no surplus. If the Social Security Trust Fund is a real trust fund, Dan, then last year we had a $27 billion deficit rather than a surplus. Next year, again, we would have no surplus at all.
Let's be clear about this. We're claiming a surplus of...
This year we'll have a surplus probably of around $70 billion, supposedly. In fact...
But at the same time, we owe the trust fund
about $90 billion.
Okay, so that's where the difference comes.
Right. So in fact, there's about a $20 billion deficit. We haven't treated the trust fund as a real trust fund. Instead, we have borrowed against it. Some would say we've raided Social Security, which we really have, to pay for ordinary operations of government.
But if we then, if I understand what President Clinton is suggesting, is that we begin to fund that trust fund in a trust fund manner, maybe not fully, but at least with 60%. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And would you support that up to where it goes, but you're saying it's just not enough?
Sure. I just think the honest way to do it is to say, let's really treat it as a trust fund. That means for the next 2 years, we would use all of the surplus to bolster Social Security rather than 60% as the President's encouraging us to do.
You would use all of it?
I would use all of it over the next 2 years, because you should, because that makes it a real trust fund. Then,
but
after the second year.
That's what the President was saying last year, wasn't he?
Well, the President said, let's save every dime of the surplus for Social Security. Now he's saying, let's save 6 cents on every dime for Social Security.
But last year, he was saying, let's save every dime.
Right.
Did you support that?
Well, yeah, I did. I've always supported taking the trust fund off budget.
Okay.
So in that sense, I supported it. But again, we got to be honest with the American people. And folks are smart. They've figured this out. The reason baby boomers are so worried about this is they get it. Right. This is a pay-as-you-go system. Their taxes are not being saved in an account for them, which frankly my parents thought was happening, and probably most people did. But instead, it's going to pay benefits right away. And that can't continue when you have fewer and fewer people working and more people retired. So if the President wants to talk about putting some of the surplus into Social Security, that's better than not dealing with it at all. But better would be, let's take the doggone trust fund off budget, allow it to build up some of these assets, because that gives us some buffer for when the baby boomers begin to retire. But we need to go even further than that if we're going to save the system.
And we'll get to the further. But even on that, though, if we took it off budget and then tried to fund it as fully as possible, that would also change the budgeting process for the rest of the budget.
Yes,
too,
it would.
Because all of a sudden we're back into a deficit. Is that correct?
That's correct.
So that changes the politics in Washington
Absolutely.
again.
Absolutely.
All right. Now, let's
and that's the reason we haven't done it on either side of the aisle, because folks wanted to be able to claim a balanced budget, and frankly, people want to spend more money.
One way or another.
One way or another, whether it's tax cuts or whether it's spending more money on government.
Let's take a second part of the President's proposal, which was his private investment accounts, what he was calling the USA accounts. What do you think of that?
Step in the right direction. Again, I'm delighted finally we're seeing some ideas from the administration on how they'd like to do it. But let's be clear, that has nothing to do with Social Security, and the President was very deliberate about that, because most Democrats do not support any kind of a private savings account, I say Democrats, in Washington, that is.
Okay.
And so what the President said was, fine, let's not have it connected with Social Security at all. Let's create over here a new, really it's a retirement vehicle, much like a 401k or a profit sharing plan. We'll call it a USA account. Instead of the employer putting matching funds in, which is what we do in our pension system, let's have the government put in matching funds. That'll help people with their retirement security. I like that concept, as you know. I'm big on taking our pension system and expanding it greatly.
And we're going to talk about
legislation to do that, because ultimately what we're talking about here, Dan, is people's security in retirement. We're not talking about Social Security versus other things. We're talking about how can people feel more secure in their retirement. So you need to do more on that side. But it does not solve the Social Security issue, because the President doesn't tie those accounts to the Social Security problem. The fact is, you can't solve the Social Security problem simply by investing more money in the trust fund, as the President has talked about, or the solution I'd rather see, which is taking the trust fund off budget. You need to do even more because of this big demographic change and people are living longer. And that's where you get into either raising taxes, which I sure don't want to do, cutting benefits, which I sure don't want to do, or getting a higher rate of return on those trust fund assets. That's the big challenge we've got in front of us.
Which is how you invest them, right?
Exactly.
And that, investing them in the equity market, in the stock market, but that makes Alan Greenspan very nervous.
It sure does.
And is he correct?
He is correct. It makes me real nervous, because what the President has proposed in order to get that higher return is you take part of the trust fund assets and you invest through the government, through Washington, into the private sector, into bonds and stocks, taking advantage of the higher return.
What's wrong with that?
Well, there are two things wrong with it. First, as long as we have this big debt out there, which we've got, remember we've got about a $5.5 trillion debt, we have to keep reminding ourselves that, yeah, we have a surplus, we also have a debt. You're going out and you're borrowing money from us as bondholders or taxpayers. You are then taking the money you borrowed and investing it. Alan Greenspan makes a good point. That doesn't really increase net savings, which is the whole idea, to increase net personal savings. So economically, it doesn't make much sense as long as we have a debt. Second, and the point that you're going to hear a lot from Alan Greenspan and from a lot of us on the Republican side, is that you have the government picking and choosing what to invest in. Yesterday we had Jesse Jackson before our committee and Jack Kemp. Jack Kemp takes a position that I take, which is let's take advantage of the returns you get in the marketplace, which is more than double the returns you're going to get by keeping it in Treasury bonds. Right. But let's let individuals decide. Let's empower individuals to be able to go out and invest that money. Jesse Jackson took the president's approach, which is let's have the government do it. So we asked him, well, Reverend Jackson, would you be willing to invest in companies, let's say, that do business with India or in tobacco stocks or in gun manufacturers? And in other words, would you allow it just to go into the private sector, into a regular diversified fund where you might have these different investments? And of course he said, no, you can't have the government investing in those things. Well, that will result, number one, in the government picking and choosing, but also a much lower rate of return if you're going to pick and choose. And we've seen that with the public pension plans in the states. They get a much lower rate of return than you or I would get in a diversified fund because they do pick and choose.
And I also think, if I understand it correctly, Alan Greenspan is saying that will skew the markets because all of a sudden certain companies will no longer look like good investments from private. Let's move on, though.
It skews it because there's so much money involved, Dan. We got to remember this. We're not just talking about a few $1 billion here or there. The government would be the single largest investor.
Yeah, we're not just talking about a few billion.
It's
no.
trillions.
Right.
Yeah, it's trillions.
Okay, let's get to your plan. What do you propose? What do you think is the right approach to this?
Well, what I've been trying to get through Congress for the last year or so is a plan that greatly simplifies the pension plans out there. This is 401ks, profit-sharing plans, private pensions, along the lines of the president's proposal. This is not part of Social Security, so that more people can get pensions. Right now, small businesses here in Greater Cincinnati, around the country, aren't offering much at all in terms of retirement savings. Only 19% of smaller companies, that's
and when we say small companies,
25 or fewer employees,
okay,
which is where most of the new employment's coming from.
Okay, so 19% of those firms,
19% of those smaller companies, which is most of the businesses in America by far,
right,
are not offering anything anymore. 401ks, a new plan that I actually got through Congress a couple years ago called a Simple Plan, they're not even offering that. They're not offering anything because it's so darn complicated. There's so much red tape, cost, burdens, and liability if you offer these so-called tax-qualified plans. So we go in and we massively simplify it and give small businesses actually some new products to be able to use where they don't have to go through all the rigmarole and red tape.
In simple language, because I'm pretty simple on finances, ask my wife, what would be an example of how you would simplify something?
Well, for instance, right now you have to go through all kinds of strange calculations to figure out whether there is so-called non-discrimination in your plan. In other words, whether you are paying people that make over $30,000 more of a contribution in terms of the match than people under 30 and so on. Well-meaning, but what's happened is it's become so complicated and so costly that small businesses just can't afford to do it. There are a lot of other just strange things about pensions right now. You can't take a pension from job to job. So in our plan we have portability. Just simplifies it, says, look, whether you work for the government, work for a nonprofit, work for a private sector, you can fold all your stuff into one plan.
Sounds like a health plan that
well, it is.
Clinton wanted.
It's the same sort of thing. I mean, you need to have portability in this mobile workforce we got right now. Folks change jobs all the time, move around. That's a no-brainer. We have a really interesting new proposal that says that if you're a smaller business, you should be able to offer a defined contribution plan, but also a defined benefit plan, which is the old style plans where you guarantee your retirement without going through all, again, the red tape and rigmarole. We also, very importantly, Dan, increase everybody's contribution limits. So you now will be able to contribute more to your 401k. Also, your employer can put more in terms of a match. Plus, there are people who come back into the workforce, and this tends to be women who have been out raising kids or taking care of family members. They can immediately get a $5,000 bump up in what they can contribute. Which is great for baby boomers because unfortunately we're finding out there that most baby boomers aren't prepared for retirement. In fact, on average, they've only put away about a third of what they're going to need to have any kind of a comfortable retirement. So this is a great idea. We also have some new plans in there, like a new 401k to let people save more and so on. And it doesn't cost that much.
Okay.
The cost is simply theoretical, that to the government it looks like cost because there's tax incentives and all this because you get a deduction. In the end, though, you'll get a lot more savings and you'll backstop Social Security.
Lots of things here.
It's the private sector approach to retirement security.
There's lots of ideas there. Is this wrapped into an actual proposal?
It is.
Or are these going to be pieces that will be floated out there?
It's one big old proposal. We actually introduced it over a year ago. We had some hearings on it last year. As you know, there was a lot of partisanship last year in Congress. And
really?
We were not able to get a budget. We were not able to get a tax bill. We were not able to move these kinds of ideas. Now, my co-sponsor is a Democrat. So this is a bipartisan approach.
Well, given that partisanship reference, given what's going on in Washington right now, and I don't want to get bogged down in that, but given what's going on, and given the fact that a presidential campaign will be starting no matter what else happens this fall, what is the window here for getting anything done, and what's the likelihood?
I think we've got about 8 to 9 months before we get into the year 2000 race.
And given the mood up there, is it as partisan as it seems from the outside, or do you, honestly, do you think there's any chance of bipartisan working together on this issue?
I'm extremely optimistic, and let me tell you why. This president, I believe, will in the end not be convicted by the Senate, although we'll see what happens. I'm for having a trial, and we need to go through the process. He will need to balance his legacy. I don't think he's going to want to be known as the president who got impeached or be known as someone connected with Monica Lewinsky. I think he's going to want to have some substantive legislative accomplishments. The balanced budget was, as you know, pushed by the Republican Congress for years. He vetoed it, finally agreed that's really not his legacy. Welfare reform was the Republican legacy. He needs something, and Social Security, I think, is his place in history. So I think he has an interest in working very hard to come up with a bipartisan solution. Republicans in Congress, in my view, have a commonality interest here because we need to pass some substantive legislation. As you know, because I've talked to you about it on and off camera, I think our problem as a Republican majority is we haven't done enough.
Right.
And this is an issue, Social Security and retirement security generally, that people really care about. It's so important to the future of this country. Not so much for people who are retired. They're going to be fine anyway. Right. It's for your generation, my generation,
1946.
and our kids and grandkids. Well, you're right at the front of it.
I'm right at the front
end.
I'm the beginning of the problem.
And
we're
this
out
is
of time.
why I think there's a commonality of interest, and we got to get it done and pull together and do it in a bipartisan way.
We're out of time, but when you were describing Clinton's situation, it sounded to me like Nixon going to China.
I think it is.
He needs something for a breakthrough.
Frankly, gives Republicans some cover to be able to come up with some solutions that make sense, because typically it's the Democrats who use Social Security against us.
We'll see. Okay, and we'll have you back.
Thanks a lot,
on
Dan.
this or something else.
Great.
Thanks, Rob.
Nice to be with you.
Okay. Including people with disabilities in every aspect of American society is a national priority. Stay tuned. After the break, we will meet the people leading the way in greater Cincinnati on this issue.
I notice more than anything is that they have no disability. You know, that chair is no obstacle to these kids. And when I first met them, it was a huge obstacle for me, but it's not to them. And now that I realize that, they're just like one of my regular kids. And
it was not yet daylight at the Children's Hospital Medical Center, but even at this early hour, the spirit of inclusion was evident everywhere, with nursing supplies to be checked, ER treatment rooms to be restocked, filing to be done, toys to be cleaned, and patients given a word of encouragement. Cletus Bagley was already picking up the first request for blood.
I love this job. It's great. I love having the responsibility. I love helping people. The patients depend on me, and the staff depend on me to do my job.
Welcome back. 6 years ago, Greater Cincinnatians of all backgrounds organized the Inclusion Network. The goal is to encourage policies and initiatives that promote the full inclusion of people with disabilities in all aspects of the community's life. One tool for raising consciousness is the awarding of the annual Inclusion Leadership Awards. Last year's award ceremony recognized the Miracle Dance Studio, which you saw just before our break, and Children's Hospital, among others. Tomorrow night, the Inclusion Network will announce its 1999 awardees. To discuss the work of the Inclusion Network and the organizations that are setting the standard in Cincinnati, I am joined by two guests. Griff Hogan is the co-director of the Inclusion Network, and Chris Kennedy is the employment coordinator of Project Search at Children's Hospital Medical Center. Welcome to both of you to Newsmakers. Chris, we just saw this little piece on Children's Hospital from last year. The hospital was one of the awardees. We heard from one person. How many people have you been able to bring in? How many people with disabilities have you been able to bring into your workforce there?
Actually, at this time, we have approximately 50 individuals with disabilities employed at Children's Hospital, and the figure keeps growing on a weekly basis. We're just so excited about how our program has taken off the past year and a half.
So this is 50 people that, is that a significant increase? Were you starting from ground zero, or were you, how much of difference does this make?
Probably when I started a few years ago, we had approximately 6 or 7 individuals with disabilities.
So a significant growth
Exactly,
there.
yes, absolutely.
Okay. Griff, the Inclusion Network, I gave sort of a general sense of it. What is it really, and who is it?
Well, the Inclusion Network is an initiative of the Mayerson Foundation, which is one of the larger family foundations in Cincinnati. And it's an organization of 3,000 members. We have people with disabilities, civic leaders, business leaders, family members, and people with disabilities, all of whom believe that including people with disabilities in every aspect of our community is something worth working for. People with disabilities are the largest minority in our country. They make up about 20% of the population.
Wow.
And having a disability, when you think about it, is the one minority group that any one of us might join today if we're not already a member. So it's something that has an appeal to all of us. It's something that we should all be concerned about.
You know, when we talked about the Inclusion Awards, and we looked at some of the organizations that won those awards, but the Inclusion Network is a lot more than giving awards for people who are doing good things. What else do you do to maybe help a children's hospital or help an organization that would like to include more people with disabilities?
We do many things. There are an awful lot of people with disabilities who live in public housing, and we have an initiative to better tie the people with disabilities who live in public housing with mental health services, social services, and religious congregations in their neighborhoods. We have an internet website. We have a public awareness campaign meant to promote issues of inclusion throughout the greater Cincinnati community. And one of the more exciting things that we're doing is partnering with Project Search at Children's Hospital to promote employment. This is part of our initiative to consult with businesses to enable them to include as many people with disabilities as employees as they possibly can.
Is this in effect sort of a pilot for that sort of consulting?
It is indeed.
Let's talk about, and I'm aware of time, let's talk about Project Search and exactly what are some of the concrete things. You talked about the increase in numbers, but what are the things that Children's Hospitals has had to do to increase those numbers?
Well, actually, it has been amazing how each area and each department have contacted us about individuals that they could possibly meet and discuss possible job opportunities in their areas, and probably the programs that have been developed over the past 2 years, the lab administration couriers, where they've hired at least 10 individuals into that area.
And that was the area that we sort of focused on here,
Exactly,
right? Okay.
Exactly. And probably the newer development has been the Welcome Center, which the hospital's in the process right now of redesigning the Welcome Center. And they came to us and they asked us if we would in fact take some of our individuals, train them, and place them in an escort kind of wayfinder position.
Okay. Griff, I know I'm very aware of time here, that we may run out of time, but how many organizations, companies in Cincinnati right now are really working like Children's Hospital is?
I don't know of any other organization that's as progressive as Children's Hospital, but virtually all companies and employers in the greater Cincinnati area are concerned about the issue of inclusion because of the Americans with Disabilities Act.
Okay.
And they're at various levels of preparation, and we're willing to work with any company that wants to be more inclusive in what they do.
If a company was interested, and I'm sorry I don't have this up, who would they call? What number would they call?
They would call the Inclusion Network at 287-6530, and we'd be happy to talk with them about the services that we offer. And
we got about 30 seconds left. Chris, what has this done for the spirit of the non-disabled people at Children's Hospital?
Oh, I can't even describe how many people, staff that come up to me on a weekly or daily basis and say, you know, these individuals bring so much energy to the hospital, and the attitudes and the spirit of the hospital has really changed through all of this. It's amazing, it really is.
Well, we're out of time. Thank you very much. Good luck with your award ceremony tomorrow night.
Thank you.
And I'm sure we're going to be covering that in the winners. Good luck.
Thank you.
Good project. Thank you for making Newsmakers a part of your Sunday morning. We leave you this morning with some old footage of Tony Sands, a pioneering local meteorologist at Channel 5. Mr. Sands was a fixture of Cincinnati, and he died this past week. This is footage from the 1950s.
Local scene. Well, I promised you a look at the radar. Well, let's come right on in here and take a look at the radar screen itself. I put the local map on the scene, and here we are in the Ohio Valley region. Here we are in Cincinnati with a current temperature of 71 degrees with a northwest wind. See this echo of clearing skies tonight. Low temperature tomorrow morning will be around 56 degrees, and tomorrow high of 76. A bulletin just given to me by Peter Grant. Word just in that an unidentified woman has jumped off the 16th floor of the Netherland Plaza Hotel. The police and fire department are answering the emergency call. And that's the weather and late bulletin.